This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Legal historian Mary Dudziak says the NSA surveillance is but part of the larger story of an America permanently at war. The Republican effort to slice the food stamp program is the proverbial canary in the coal mine, says regular commentator Catherine Poe. And Professor Dan Zuberi has studied the Canadian and U.S. hospital systems and says patients are at risk from the outsourcing of labor. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Historian Mary Dudziak asks the question of how we can unbuild the NSA surveillance apparatus. She also explains how waving the flag helps the American people ignore a very warlike foreign policy. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Mary Dudziak is a law professor at Emory University, where she is director of the Project on War and Security in Law, Culture, and Society. She is the author of the book called Wartime, which investigates the relationship between war and time itself, and between war and civil liberties. Mary Dudziak, thank you very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, you're quite welcome. Your book makes the point that history has conveniently been divided into wartime and peacetime, but it isn't that simple, is it?
Well, the divisions between wartime and peacetime, that's how American history is often written and told. That's what we assume about the American past, that there are two kinds of time, essentially. There's wartime and peacetime, and history consists of moving from one kind of time to the other. So from wartime to peacetime to wartime to peacetime. And of course, even chapters of history books will be divided based on divisions between wartime and peacetime. And so there's World War I, then there's the quote-unquote interwar years, and then there's World War II, and sometimes those will be different chapters. But when you look at the history of American military engagements around the world, you don't see those neat divisions at all. Instead, you see kind of an ongoing timeline of U.S. involvement in conflict.
Mm-hmm. In this era of history, wars aren't declared anymore. In fact, I think World War II was the last time we declared war. But they don't exactly end either, do they?
Well, about the declarations, there are times when Congress and the President together debate going to war. And so the Iraq war that's, been going on post 9/11 is an example of the President going to Congress and saying, please authorize war. So we do have some points when Congress signs on and says, yes, we're authorizing military force. But the endings, two things. One is often forces being used before those moments, like FDR as commander-in-chief, involving American forces before Pearl Harbor. But then the endings of war sort of trickle on for a while, and Iraq is a good example because the U.S. military action in Iraq began in March 2003. Then May 1, 2003, that was when President Bush said mission accomplished, which of course everyone has criticized. But then August 18th, 2010, Obama had what I think of as his own mission accomplished moment when he went on television and there were all these reporters who talked about how the combat mission in Iraq was ending, and the evidence of that was troops basically going in trucks across the border to Kuwait. But sure enough, combat conditions persisted, according to the Army. So the soldiers, 50,000 soldiers, stayed in Iraq, and they were in combat conditions. They complained, well, are we still going to get combat duty pay if combat is over? And the Army had to say, well, sure, yes, you are. So we had these efforts to call the war in Iraq to say that it had ended, when sure enough we've still got troops deployed. We've still got military engagement on the ground in Iraq. So that's an example of presidents wanting to call a wartime over when the conditions on the ground aren't changing dramatically.
And we, the public, seem to accept it when the president says, hey, it's over, don't we?
Well, the American people don't pay a lot of attention to American war, right?
Mm-hmm.
They would rather watch a reality TV show than be politically engaged in the nation's use of armed force. And so this idea that there's a phenomenon called peacetime, and that's our regular time, and that's what we usually live in, people like to think that way, and that's certainly enabled by the fact that U.S. military action is happening in other parts of the world. So it's other people who are experiencing that, and for Americans at home, it's troops, it's their families, it's people who live in and around American-based communities. They're the ones who are directly affected by American military action. Most of us are completely insulated from it.
We're speaking with Mary Dudziak, law professor at Emory University, author of a book called Wartime, which investigates the relationship between war and time itself and between war and civil liberties. How does wartime affect domestic policies and civil liberties?
Well, the usual way of thinking about American history is that it's only during what we call wartime that we have severe restrictions of civil liberties, and then in peacetime those go away. So there's a swinging pendulum, right? During wartime we protect security and give up liberty. During peacetime the liberties are supposed to come back. And there's certainly moments when there are terrible rights abuses associated with particular wars. During World War I, there was real suppression of free speech, and people were thrown in jail for basically protesting the draft, which we would think of now as a basic First Amendment liberty. During World War II, after Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans, both citizens and Japanese nationals, were thrown in internment camps. So, terrible violation of the rights of both Americans and others. So those are examples of great rights violations related to war. But because because we are now in a context where the global threat is conceptualized in a way that there's simply no way of drawing a meaningful ending to it. The continuation of what President Bush called a quote-unquote war on terror. And because we've built an infrastructure to surveil in a way that ends up sort of running on its own and being subject to no meaningful limits, the NSA surveillance process that we've been hearing about in the news. What we've done is we've sort of built up an apparatus that, when is the NSA surveillance going to come to an end? We don't have a moment when that's going to shut down, in part because war is imagined as something that isn't located in a territory, isn't located in time, but is a war against quote-unquote terror, what we're afraid of. And so there's no moment when we'd be able to sort of come together politically and say the threat that we're worried about has been eradicated such that we can unbuild these surveillance programs and sort of reestablish the kind of privacy and liberty that Americans think of as sort of part of what American democracy is about. So basically there's a great concern now that because of the nature of the surveillance programs that have been put in place, and because the way the war is thought about, a war on on terrorist groups, that there doesn't seem to be a point when the current programs put in place are going to sunset, are going to come to an end.
Is war then a more permanent part of U.S. history and experience than people are led to believe?
Yes. I mean, short answer,
yeah.
Yes. There's been people are paying attention to that more recently, with concerns about, is this war on terror ever going to come to an end? But there were big and small wars throughout the 20th century. American soldiers were deployed all over the world, in between the wars that end up being chapters in our history books. So we've basically had, once we have U.S. deployment globally, and we view American security as requiring the projection of American military force around the world, so that we need American troops all over the world in order to keep us safe at home, as opposed to, for example, working with allies and having a sense of protection of American security more through diplomacy, and less through projection of military force. So basically, that puts a structure in place that keeps us militarily deployed all over the world, with small and large conflagrations popping up here and there, many just completely outside the attention of the American people.
We're speaking with Mary Dudziak, law professor at Emory University and author of the book called Wartime, which investigates the relationship between war and time itself, and between war and civil liberties. What about all the flag waving and support the troops rhetoric from civilians? Does that help glorify and thus continue a never-ending state of wartime?
Well, what I would say is it actually helps us continue to ignore it. And that might seem counterintuitive, right? Because we have much more frequently in the past, right? Because American veterans felt so dismissed after Vietnam. And in part in reaction to that, there's so much more of an effort to thank American soldiers and veterans for their service. And I think regardless of one's politics, people in the military, people who have served, are doing work the country is calling upon its citizens to do that only a small segment are signing up for. So I think we should all thank them for their service, but we should go beyond that. So what we do is thank them for their service, let them go first onto the airplanes, and put a yellow ribbon on the Christmas tree. But even when President Obama and other presidents call upon us to thank our service members, they don't ask us to be politically engaged with what the American military is being asked to do. And so this, periodic, essentially genuflecting to recognizing the service of American soldiers, it is a way of, having us momentarily pay attention, but it also, I think, helps enable us to say, okay, I did my duty. I wrote a thank you note. I sent a check to a veterans organization, and now I'm going to turn the TV channel. So I think it actually enables the way that Americans tend to check out of political engagement with what the American military is being asked to do.
Okay. Mary Dudziak, law professor at Emory University. She is the author of the book called Wartime, which investigates the relationship between war and time itself, and between war and civil liberties. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going, and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Regular commentator Catherine Poe is worried that the Republican assault on food stamps is just a canary in the coal mine, warning about further social service cuts. And we'll hear from her in just a minute. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
In 1972, I was part of a nationwide campaign that came close to getting the U.S. Senate to reject Earl Butz, Richard Nixon's choice for Secretary of Agriculture. A coalition of grassroots farmers, consumers, and public interest organizations teamed up with progressive senators to undertake the almost impossible challenge of defeating the cabinet nominee. The 51-44 Senate vote was so close because we were able to expose Butz as butt ugly. We brought the abusive power of corporate agribusiness into the public consciousness for the first time. We had won a moral victory, but it turned out to be a curse and a blessing. First, the curse. Butz had risen to prominence in the world of agriculture by devoting himself to the corporate takeover of the global food economy. He openly promoted the preeminence of middlemen food manufacturers over family farmers. Agriculture is no longer a way of life, he barked. It's a business. He instructed farmers to get big or get out, and proceeded to shove tens of thousands of them out by promoting an export-based, corporate-run food economy. Adapt, he warned, or die. The ruination of farms and rural communities, Butz added, releases people to do something useful in our society. This is Jim Hightower saying the curse of Butz, however, spun off a blessing. Small farmers and food artisans practically threw up at the resulting Twinkie-ization of America's food. They were sickened that nature's own contribution to human culture was being turned into another plasticized product of corporate profiteers. They threw themselves into creating and sustaining a viable alternative, linking locally with consumers, environmentalists, community activists, marketers, and others. The Good Food Rebellion has since sprouted, spread, and blossomed from coast to coast. To find farmers markets and other expressions of this movement right where you live, go to localharvest.org.
If you like these feisty pops of populism that Hightower zings out on the airwaves, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter provides the in-depth lowdown on what the greed heads of Wall Street and the boneheads of Washington are doing to us behind the scenes. With Hightower's saucy Texas humor and truth-telling populist perspective, the lowdown literally can lift you up. And get this, you can have the lowdown delivered to your mailbox or email each month for only $15 a year. Yes, 12 issues, only $15. Check it out, hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Regular commentator Catherine Poe is worried that the Republican assault on food stamps is just a harbinger for further social service cuts. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, regular contributor and blogger Catherine Poe, a former president of Long Island Now, and she was selected as one of the top progressives in the state of Maryland, along with Senator Barbara Mikulski and Congresswoman Donna Edwards. Catherine Poe, thank you as always for joining us on americasdemocrats.org.
It's good to be here, Jim.
And always good to talk with you as well. You know, amazingly, Republicans have voted to cut the food stamp program, arguably one of the most successful anti-poverty programs of all time. Why do you believe this issue is a canary in the coal mine?
Well, I think it's pretty simple. It's by cutting the food stamps at this time in our history, it reveals who we are as Americans, and it ain't pretty. And I even say that about Democrats because, let's face it, the $5 billion cut that was made to the food stamp program was voted for by a huge majority of the Democrats. So that is pretty awful. And, of course, now the Republicans want a $40 billion cut on top of that. So even as the Dow is soaring to new heights, we have unemployment, and then, of course, we have permanent unemployment, where people have just given up looking. And that has driven 47 million people onto food stamps, and that includes millions and millions of children as well. And people don't look at this and they say, well, there was only a 5% cut that was made when they cut that $5 billion. For a family of four, they will now, they will only get $632 a month. And I've had people say, well, that doesn't sound so bad. Well, for 4 people, that's $21 a day. That becomes much. Then it starts to hit home. Can you do that? In fact, there are people who are actually putting out the challenge. Can you live on this? Feed your family on $21 a day. See what happens. So that's pretty shameful, and that's why I say it's the canary in the coal mine.
Well, the other thing about that too, for folks taking up the challenge, and I commend you for doing so if you're one of those doing so, but you're doing it from your house that's very well heated and very comfortable, most likely.
Yes.
Right? You're not
right.
Your electricity bill and all those other things, that's not part of it for you. It is for those folks, though. I mean, they're scraping. They don't want to spend all of that $21 because they've got other things to worry. I mean, it's just it's just awful.
Exactly. And then all of a sudden it becomes like, well, for the children, no. How do you make a healthy meal? As we all know, when you start trying to eat in a healthy way and not just eat carbs all the time, it's very expensive. Macaroni and cheese is cheap, but that is not good for kids all the time. So I'm trying to get meat on the table every single day. You're right, yeah. So this is why it's awful.
Yeah. Why should Congress cut the food stamp program if other programs are being cut to balance the budget? I mean, what about other farm subsidies?
Yeah, right. Well, first of all, we're shredding the safety net again. When Republicans aren't trying to shred the Social Security or Medicare or any of other safety nets, this will look like, I guess, an easy target. And, of course, then we had, including Democrats who are from farming states, that then saw this as in their best interest to get votes, which is crazy. And you just should not be doing that. I mean, this is like insane, especially when you realize, which most people don't know, I don't think. We know. This is like, I'm only talking about billionaires with a B. There are 50 billionaires who collect millions in subsidies yearly, including, are you ready for this, Warren Buffett, all right, from farm subsidies. And then you have the corporate farmers who get these subsidies as well. So it's not the mom and pop farms, which are basically disappearing anyway. There's some very big money involved in here, and it's basically farm welfare is really sort of what's going on. So fine if they want to do that, but you don't do it on the back of poor people who are now unemployed. And also, people have to remember, when you give food stamps, that money comes back into the economy and does help the economy. The other thing, of course, it feeds children. We don't want children going to school hungry. We don't want American children being malnourished. I mean, this is America. So this is why there's certain things. We don't cut our Medicare. We don't cut our Social Security. We should not be cutting food stamps. Those are our safety nets.
We're speaking with Catherine Poe, regular contributor and blogger here on americasdemocrats.org. Republicans complained that since President Obama took office, the number of people on food stamps has doubled, and the cost of food stamps has quadrupled. Are they right?
Right. Exactly. And back in the last 10 years, the number of people on food stamps has soared in 10 years from 21 million to 47 million people. All right? And the cost, they're also right on that, has ballooned from $21 billion, with a B, dollars, okay, to $75 billion. I mean, and it's really amazing. But the reason, of course, is the stagnant and often faltering economy. It's still far from all the way back. And like I said, a lot of people have basically even quit working because there are no jobs. It isn't they don't want to work, there's just no jobs. And it's all thanks to that Great Recession that we're still trying to pull out of, that was left to us. Everybody keeps saying don't look to the past, but this was left to us by President Bush, who destroyed the surplus that President Clinton left us. So just look at that. And then we have, I think maybe one of the best examples is looking at people who work for McDonald's. And the average worker there gets about $7.75. That's the average worker, $7.75 an hour. Now, it varies across the country, but that's what the average is. And let's say they work 8 hours a day, six days a week, 52 weeks a year. Their salary equals $19,344 a year. Now, and here's what I have them. They don't only get one day off. All right?
Right.
And they got no vacation time. That was 52 weeks. They still only make a little over 19,000 a year.
Taxes. And then taxes.
Right. Don't forget, there's still taxes to pay, and there's Social Security coming out of that. Right.
So they don't really make $19,000 a year.
No, they really don't. Not when you finally, with the take-home pay, it's not going to be that amount. Right. Exactly. And of course, as we all know, there have been protests across the country where they've been trying to raise it from anywhere from $12 to $15 an hour, which I think is sort of interesting, and which McDonald's has no interest for. And they even had something called how to get yourself out of on their website. McDonald's put this out for their workers, and it was how to get yourself, I'm not saying it right, digging out from holiday debt. All right? This is for their workers. They didn't give them a raise. They gave them tips. One was break your food into smaller portions. And yeah, right. Another one was sell things on Craigslist that you don't need. Okay, it was interesting. So it was like goofy stuff like this. There was nothing, I didn't see them saying you get free gift certificates to give people as gifts from McDonald's. Even there's nothing like that. It was all basically as you can see, it's you. You have useless things you should be getting rid of, and you're eating too much. You see how they see digging out from debt. You can go to their website and see it.
Yeah, it's your fault, not ours. Yeah. Well, and there's the other thing, too. I mean, so you're bringing in a living wage. Washington State has, I think, the highest in the country.
They do, yes.
And then you've got the District of Columbia, the state of Maryland, who have put forth at least... We'll see where it goes, but they have plans to raise their own. So maybe the states just have to take this over and do it for themselves. And does anybody ever think about the fact that because the first thing you hear is, well, it hurts businesses, but if you're making more money, you're going to go out and spend more money. Right,
exactly.
So
and that's what they are. I know. Well, look at Walmart. They're having a food drive for their employees, not a food drive for the community. You drop off cans for their employees. I mean, I would be so embarrassed. I don't understand a place that pays the CEO $21 million a year having a food drive for its own employees because you don't pay them enough. That to me is weird.
That's the most amazing thing in the world.
Isn't it? Yeah.
So who are we talking about on food stamps? It's not just people sitting around on the couch all day not doing anything at all, right? I mean, some of these folks have a couple of different jobs and still can't make enough money and still need food stamps. So would cutting the program actually get people back to work?
I know. It's interesting. But, because there's no jobs there, so how are people going to get back to work? And there's nothing. That's the biggest problem. The people who have lost their jobs, those jobs are gone. There are no jobs for them. So this is a major problem. And for many people being retrained, at say, anybody almost over 45 or 50, it becomes really difficult for them to get back into the workforce. So it's a problem. Actually, I have sort of a good story when you said who's on food stamps. The Democratic candidate running for Congress in the district I live in, which is the 1st District of Maryland, and he told a story. He's running against an extremely right-wing conservative who represents this district, a horrible representative of our district, Congressman Andy Harris. And his is who has been who votes always on the right and has been a big supporter of ending the whole food stamp subsidy business. But our candidate, John LaFurla, had told a story about when he came from a family, didn't have a lot of money, and he worked his way through college, and then he was married when he went to medical school. And so he, was working his way through and all this kind of thing, but he had a family, and they were on food stamps when he was in medical school. And it got them through, and of course, he's a doctor here in the area. So, and it's interesting because so is Andy Harris. We have 2 doctors running against each other. So I thought it was interesting when people say, who is it? Well, one was a guy who hadn't been on food stamps, could not have finished medical school to become a doctor who has been a great asset to the community. So, it's not like you said, it's not the person sitting on the couch drinking the beer saying, I don't want to work. That's not who these people are.
Now, are those people out there? Yes, of course they are, and they always will be. But there are too many people that work hard, that need welfare, that need that safety net, and it's ludicrous to think that we just turn a blind eye to these people.
Oh, it is, absolutely. It's just amazing to me, and I don't understand why it's not a bigger issue, except that we get it's easier to talk about the problems with Obamacare than to talk about food stamps, and it moves the conversation away from something that I think most people would be really upset about if they really understood what was going on.
Yeah. Now, before we let you go, why is it that you think Republican plan to slash the food stamps by $40 billion will end in a backlash among the evangelicals and Catholics?
Yeah, there has been some rumblings about that. More and more you're seeing it. And it's because they are both groups have been big supporters of the food stamps, probably because they have their own food pantries for the poor. And if anybody even talks to anybody in the community where the churches and the synagogues are having food pantries, they will tell you they're bare. Their shelves are bare. They can't keep them stocked. So they know firsthand that this is happening and that people need food stamps. They say charities and churches and synagogues and temples should be taking care of this is ludicrous. There's no way they can do it. There's just absolutely no way they can feed the hungry. And of course, feeding the hungry has always been a Christian mission. I mean, that's one of their big missions. So no wonder the evangelicals and the Catholics are so gung-ho on this. And I know there have been some Christian groups, conservative Christian groups, have actually been lobbying their representatives not to cut food stamps. They see it in their own parishes, just how drastic the hunger problem is. So I think there will be a ripple effect because of the Scrooge vote of so many Republicans. And I think it won't probably, because like I said, not enough people really know what's going on. But I think it's going to be maybe the kind of thing that can have a tipping effect on some candidates that they may find their races are much closer, because if they're questioned about it, that isn't necessarily. They may be conservative in a lot of things, but they're not conservative about feeding the poor and the hungry in their own, in their own congregations, in their own community. So I think it could begin to have at least a small backlash on Republicans.
Okay. Catherine Poe, regular contributor and blogger here on americasdemocrats.org, joining us from time to time. And as always, Catherine, we appreciate your time and look forward to doing it again soon.
Thanks. It was good talking to you, Jim.
You as well. We'll do it again soon, I promise. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And finally, health analyst Dan Zuberi has studied labor practices in both Canadian and U.S. hospitals and has found that outsourcing many of the routine jobs can have fatal consequences for patients. And we are joined now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, by Dan Zuberi. He's Associate Professor of Social Policy at the University of Toronto and the author of a new book called Cleaning Up: How Hospital Outsourcing is Hurting Workers and Endangering Patients. Dan Zuberi, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you for having me.
Well, you're quite welcome. You've written about problems that arise from the widespread outsourcing of service jobs in hospitals. What are the biggest threats to patient safety from this practice?
What I found in my research on hospitals is that when these jobs are outsourced, and this is including hospital cleaners and other support workers, all of a sudden there are fewer workers who are now expected to complete the same or even a greater amount of work. So I looked at hospitals in Vancouver where all of these jobs were privatized in 2003 and completed in-depth interviews with 70 hospital support workers, as well as 26 interviews with physicians, nurses, and other infection control experts, as well as doing some observation research and behind-the-scenes tours. And what I found was that before outsourcing, when a hospital wing used to have 3 cleaners, after outsourcing, they would now have 2. Again and again, I heard stories of severe understaffing, which resulted in overworked and stressed workers, and most disturbingly of all, cut corners. So when workers were overstressed and they were given too many tasks to complete, they had to simply selectively cut corners, take shortcuts to try to get as much done as they could in their shift. Unfortunately, a lot of the corners that they cut are exactly the kind of things that increase risk factors for hospital-acquired infections and the transmission of these infections to patients. In addition, even more disturbingly in some ways, these private sector contractors skimped out on providing basic supplies like gloves, enough mops, new rags, uniforms. These are kind of basic things that are necessary for infection control. For the contractors, employing fewer workers and spending less money on supplies meant greater profits in the short term. But for patients in the healthcare system, for these hospitals, meant dirtier environments and a greater risk of infection.
Don't hospital professionals themselves contribute to patient safety issues? I mean, why blame the contract workers?
It's very important that to say that I'm not blaming individual contract workers for these issues. In fact, my research is done in partnership with them and in the hopes of generating better work conditions and improved salaries and benefits, because I think what they do is so important. The problem is that outsourcing and contracting out has set up these workers to fail by denying them the basic tools, training, and resources they need to do a proper job in the hospitals. So on the one hand, lots of complicated factors explain the rising hospital-acquired infection threat. But there are direct links to outsourcing of these jobs as well. So in one case, at the Nanaimo Regional General Hospital on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, a major C. difficile outbreak sickened hundreds of patients and killed 5 in 2008. An audit done by the British Columbia CDC pointed to many causes of this outbreak, including poor hospital design and malfunctioning equipment. But it also explicitly points to inadequate cleaning by contracted-out cleaners. The audit reports that these cleaners did not clean high-traffic areas of the hospital because they were too crowded with patients. They also improperly mixed their cleaning solution with 100 times more water per part bleach than necessary to effectively kill pathogens. So literally, they were cleaning the hospital with something not much stronger than water. After the audit was done, some reforms were implemented, but the cleaners continued to work for the same contractor. 2 years later, in 2010, the hospital had 2 more major outbreaks, this time of C. difficile and norovirus. So the process of contracting out these jobs leads to a loss of control over critically important dimensions of the hospital that sometimes only becomes apparent in a crisis or an outbreak, where teamwork, training, and skills become paramount. So it's not that the workers are responsible for infections, but that the process of outsourcing, especially to the lowest bidder, has created a system that sets up workers to fail and infections to thrive.
We're speaking with Dan Zuberi, Associate Professor of Social Policy at the University of Toronto and the author of the new book called Cleaning Up, How Hospital Outsourcing is Hurting Workers and Endangering Patients. Conditions for contract workers in hospitals also endanger their own health, in addition to the safety of patients. How does that happen?
Yes, in the book I report that over 60% of the workers I interviewed had been sickened or injured on the job. Working in a hospital can be dangerous. Not only are these support workers exposed to all kinds of germs, but also toxic chemicals and highly toxic medications. The workers I interviewed reported being injured, sometimes by heavy equipment. Others had repetitive strain injuries. They were stressed out. They had issues when they were overexerted. They slipped and fell. They smashed hands into doors. Some also suffered from needle sticks. One was even attacked by a patient. So these aren't the safest work environments. They're also heavily exposed to colds, flus, and other infectious germs. Prior to outsourcing, these hospital support workers had a fair number of paid sick days. They were adequately trained. They could use their sick days to stay home and recover if they got sick before returning to work around immunocompromised patients. When their jobs were contracted out, part of what they lost were many of these paid sick days. And so now many of them, unsurprisingly, I guess, actually come to work even when they're sick or injured, which puts patient health further at risk.
What do you think hospital outsourcing portends for the future of both healthcare and other industries?
Hospital outsourcing is a representative and contributing trend that's adding to the explosion of insecure, poorly paid jobs in the service sector in many countries, not just the U.S. I argue these bad jobs are not just bad for these workers and their families, but actually all of us. Healthcare spending in the U.S. comprises something like 20% of GDP. It's a major and growing employer in the post-industrial American economy. And the trend towards outsourcing lower-skilled jobs in many industries is contributing to growing inequality and working poverty in America. It will also contribute to the increased vulnerability of workers, lower quality of work, and more hazardous environments that provide greater risks for both consumers and patients alike.
And the critical nature of safe hospital services are obvious, but doesn't the widespread outsourcing of jobs contribute to income and social inequality across all industries?
Definitely. Hospital outsourcing is but one example of many, one that I argue has direct implications for our own health and well-being, as well as those whose jobs are being contracted out. In the wake of major tragedies in the subcontracted factories in developing countries that manufacture much of our clothing and many consumer goods, we've set up certification programs to attempt to hold major retailers and other corporations who profit from these arrangements to account and improve working conditions. But what about domestically, right here in the U.S.? Contracting out has become a way for major institutions in America, often institutions with tremendous resources and wealth from nonprofits, banks, and universities, to avoid responsibility of providing decent wages, benefits, and work conditions to lower-tier workers. For example, the SEIU just reported that Seattle's airport is now considering outsourcing many airport jobs, including baggage handlers, who will now literally earn less than 50% of their previous hourly wage to do the same work. Domestic outsourcing and contracting out is one of the ways that managers are rolling back hard-fought gains by workers and contributing to growing economic polarization, hardship, and the hollowing out of the American middle class, the foundation of economic prosperity in America, Canada, and most other advanced industrialized countries. We need to fight back not only to help these workers, but to improve the quality of life and safety of all Americans. Thank you.
Okay. Dan Zuberi is Associate Professor of Social Policy at the University of Toronto and the author of the new book called Cleaning Up: How Hospital Outsourcing is Hurting Workers and Endangering Patients. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome, and look forward to speaking with you again soon. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible: Mary Dudziak, Catherine Poe, and Dan Zuberi. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to